My name is Addie Perkins Williamson, and I am part of the Michigan Mafia. Could other members please raise your hands? Thank you. For that reason, this is really old home week for me. It's great to see some of my colleagues here, some of you for the first time in a while. So I am absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Um, I started my career straddling corporate and academia. So I worked at the Chase Manhattan Bank, and then Pfizer, Pepsi, and then American Express. Now, I know it seems as though I couldn't keep a job, but each one of them was a progression in my learning and development. And while I was working there in each of those firms, I also taught at Baruch, NYU, and Columbia. So I straddled for as long as I could before I had to make a decision. And corporate won out, I should say. I left American Express and started my own firm, and about the same time, I began to work with an organization called the Executive Leadership Council. How many of you are familiar with the ELC? Ooh, really? Great. All right, so then you probably know, and for those of you who don't, ELC started, it was born because back 31 years ago, there were not very many African Americans in the top levels of corporate America. And one evening at either an Urban League dinner or an NAACP dinner, four of them found themselves. And how delighted they were. Oh my goodness. And they made a pact to meet on a regular basis, or at least a periodic basis, share war stories, ask questions, because as you can imagine back then, things would happen and they wouldn't know how to interpret them. So from that time, they grew to 50 members, and that's about the time I started to join them. And they started to formalize their gatherings. And they also began to understand that it wasn't a given that there would be replacements for them when they left their roles. If they were going to make sure that there was a pipeline of talent, of black talent in particular, who was always ready for ascending to the highest levels of corporate America, they would have to do something about it. It wasn't going to happen naturally. It wasn't going to happen organically. And so they decided to focus on middle-level managers. And the first thing they did was to create a mid-level managers symposium. And they started with about 25 people, and they brought them together after their big dinner that they had every year. The idea being, let's share our knowledge, let's share our wisdom, our experiences, our how-tos with the next generation of senior leaders, because without that knowledge, there's just no way to learn it. Well, fast forward to today. Today, the ELC organization is 700 plus members strong. And that MLMS, that Mid-Level Managers Symposium, last year had 1,000 participants. So they know that they make a difference. And they also realize that even the mid-level manager level is too late. So they have gradually been going to earlier and earlier in people's careers, such that at this point, they have programming for college students and scholarships, for college students and graduate students. They have programming for your first manager kind of role, and everything from first level manager all the way through board level positions and preparation for it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on between myself and the ELC, because we've been working together a lot. Two of those programs I mentioned to you, I helped them to develop and run for many years. And I should say that I am back, as well as running my own company, Perkins Williamson Associates. I've been working with the ELC now, I work with them now, to take their Institute for Leadership Development and Research to the next level, and I'm delighted to do so. So, what I hope to share with you this morning are some lessons learned from two vantage points, from my own vantage point in PWA and a lot of the work I've done around crossing the finish line, and then from the ELC Chief Learning Officer experience, where we've been actively engaged, and many of you have been working with them over the years, yes, with me. I want to start with a few facts, because remember, we've been at this for darn near 30 years. When you look at the data around 2015, it shows that that white each, and Asians make up roughly 6%. So whether you believe the census or not, let's just start with this. When you look at first level and mid-level managers, you see that whites represent 62% of the workforce, but they disproportionately represent 77% of first and mid-level managers. Hispanics and blacks are disproportionately represented at around 7 to 8% of the workforce. You'll see that there's slightly more black women in first and mid-level manager positions than black men. And only Asians are, according to this data, proportionately represented in first and mid-level manager roles. When we move to the senior and executive level leaders, we see a major change. Whites dominate this level of the hierarchy at 86%. Asian executives are proportionately represented, while Hispanic and black execs are significantly underrepresented. And at the same time, Hispanic execs tend, according to this data, to fare slightly better than their black counterparts. Black men are slightly better represented than black women. When you look at the very top of the house, when you look at black CEOs, you'll see that there are 5. Between the Fortune 500 and the S&P 500, there are 5. There used to be one woman, Ursula Burns, who you know retired recently. And then at the very highest level of the food chain are blacks on corporate boards. And they are, again, underrepresented and not making a whole lot of progress. So between 2012 and 2016, we saw only a very small increase in their number. And the number of women is, of course, very, very small. When we look at the industries, with the largest share of black execs, what's most striking as you look at the data is not the industries that are there, but the industries that are not there. We'll try not to do that again. I don't know what happened. What's not there are the technology, science, engineering, and mathematics industries. And even the industries that you see here, black representation is still underrepresented. So in the rapidly emerging digital technical workspace that we're focusing on today, you'll see that only 5% of scientists and engineers are black. And we are significantly underrepresented in terms of the part of the creation of the present and future workforce that is digital technical. So while we've been at this for 30 years, we still have quite a bit of work to do to make sure that we have the skill set and the presence and the visibility that's necessary. So with that said, how do we do that? And I'm speaking really based on my experience both in my own firm and at the ELC in terms of leadership development and what I focus on heavily, career acceleration for black executives, because ELC is very focused on not only a multicultural perspective, but in particular, what is the experience of the black executive. So we think of ourselves as being in the business of future-ready leadership, people who are ready to ascend to higher levels in their organizations. And the primary focus is indeed on Blacks in corporate America, but we think the principles and the how-tos that we give people are applicable in all arenas, in all organizations. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that the ELC has learned over time is that when you're talking about building a strong pipeline of Black talent, it requires you to begin early. It requires, no, I'll tell you, in reality, it begins at the dinner table. When you as parents go home and talk about your workplace experience and how you are dealing with it, it teaches your children how to behave, what to expect when they enter the workforce. But our efforts begin pretty much in high school, as I mentioned, and college, because we know that if we can't begin to intrigue people at that point, if we don't have role models for them, if we can't help them to see themselves eventually getting to be people like yourselves, then we were not going to make any progress. So, future-ready leadership starts as early as possible. Now, a key learning for all of our execs is play the game and play it well. Now, what's been interesting is there are a lot of people who've told us in our programs on day one, they didn't know there was a game being played. So I ask you, is there a game being played where you work? Unless you work alone, I promise you, there is. And every organization where there's a game being played has a set of rules, yes? And who makes the rules? That's a question. The person with the gold? Okay, he who has the gold makes the rules. So the person at the top makes the rules. So we have our new president of Morehouse College here, and he makes the rules, right? He makes the rules, or he should, or he will represent a coaching opportunity. All right? So a lot of our effort is really focused on helping people understand that, because the rules of the game change at every successive level. And remember, we're talking about people who are just becoming managers, all the way up to people who are in the C-suite and working at the board level. Understanding the game, understanding the rules, understanding how they apply to you, and how not to trip over them. We spend a fair amount of our time focused on those kinds of things. So, one of the first things we tell people is the ticket to the game is your outstanding performance, delivered consistently with results. And so we tell our folks, if your performance is an issue, that's where you need to spend your time and attention. Because you're not going to get ahead without video if you don't have good results. Otherwise, the expectation is that you will do what it takes to deliver well on a consistent basis. Is that not true in academia as well? Who makes the rules in academia? Your dean? Who decides whether or not you are doing a good job? Do you know? The Board of Trustees decides whether you're doing a good job? How do they know that you're doing a good job? The tenured faculty? Okay, now what do we have going on here? Some people don't really know. Sure. You think you have more different experiences than, say, people in corporate America? So let me just say that it's very difficult to be successful when you don't know what it takes to be successful. It's very difficult to be successful when you don't know who is deciding whether you're successful, right? So that's the kind of help we try to give the people who come through our programs. And so that leads me to my next point. We know that there are what I call the big six critical success factors, and they tend to be applicable almost wherever you work, right? So let's start with the first one. Oh, well, I can't start with the first one. They're all up there. So let me start with the first one that's already up there. Relationship building and networking. One of the things that we work on in almost every one of our programs is to help people understand that relationships make the world go round. That relationships tend to trump, and I'm not using that word, they tend to trump almost everything else. And I think we have had some examples of that over the past year, would you say? Where relationships have maybe superseded complete and utter competence, or other variables that may be true. That's not just happening in our before us every day, but it does actually happen everywhere, everywhere. So when you think about the relationships that are important to your career success, do you know who those people are? Are they part of your network? Do you know how to manage those relationships? Do you know how to enhance those relationships? So that's something that we focus on pretty carefully. And then when you hear the word networking, a lot of people think it's pretty overworked, that word. But that's because they don't understand the significance of strategic networking. And I actually think of networking, a network as just a collection of relationships. Some of those relationships are strategic. Others of them are for fun. But what we don't ever want you to do is underestimate the power of relationships. Moving on to the second, mentor. We spend a lot of time focused on mentors because I mentioned earlier that every successive level has its own set of rules. How do you learn them? You learn them from your mentor, right? In corporate America, it's impossible, and that's a strong statement, it's impossible to get to the top without a mentor. The rules become more arcane, and you need someone to guide you through the successive levels. I make a distinction between mentor and sponsor because they play different roles. A sponsor is someone who can give you the job or can influence the person who can give you the job. And so it's, once again, a bold statement, impossible to continue to have career success without a series of sponsors. Visibility and exposure. If you're working really hard in your office and no one sees your work, is it helpful? How does it help your career if no one knows what you're doing, if no one knows how well you're doing? So your opportunity to gain visibility with the people who can become mentors and sponsors is pretty critical. And then the last two are relatively new: technological agility and analytics, and the global perspective. In corporate America, those have become increasingly important. And so as we continue our leadership development work, we help our participants to understand how that impacts their work and their ability to be as successful as possible. So, thank you for your attention, and I'll be delighted to answer questions later. Thank you.